Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, interested audience, and distinguished panelists. My name is Stefanie Linzer from the Forest Policy Research Network at the University of Natural Resources and Life Sciences in Vienna in Austria. I'm an expert for criteria and indicators of sustainable forest management, and I will moderate and guide you through this webinar, How Close to Nature is the Management of European Forests, in the following 2.5 hours. As a short background, I would like to highlight that the EU Green Deal has significantly shifted the EU approach towards forests and their management. Forests have been targeted as the main land use sector to allow the EU to achieve its ambitious 2050 climate and biodiversity related objectives. Forests and forest management in the EU will be strongly influenced through the legally binding proposals, such as the Fit for 55 package, the taxonomy regulation, and the upcoming nature restoration law. At the same time, calls for closer to nature forest management and the strict protection of 10% of EU land, including all remaining primary and old growth forests, are among the objectives of the EU Biodiversity Strategy for 2030 and also of the new EU Forest Strategy for 2030. And these seem to be ambitious and far-going, while not necessarily building on existing management experiences within the European Union. The current EU policy agenda has assigned climate change mitigation as one of the main roles of EU forests. It is expected from forests to offset greenhouse gas emissions from other sectors. And simultaneously, EU forests are expected to fulfill extremely ambitious conservation and protection targets. And such approaches clearly touch the core functioning of European forests and their management paradigm, with possible drastic changes in the functioning of forests in the near future. To contribute to the ongoing discussion, EUSTAFOR and CEPF, representing the European forest owners and managers, they jointly organized this webinar to support a balanced expert debate on new management approaches for European forests, namely options for closer to nature forest management practices and active protection or passive conservation, determining the best strategy for the future. So I'm really looking forward now to interesting presentations and a fruitful discussion. However, before I will give the word to the EUSTAFOR President, Mr. Reinhard Neft, for his welcoming words, I would like to shortly introduce the webinar modalities and the housekeeping rules. So we will first have a keynote presentation by Professor Bauhus, followed by a series of expert panel presentations and a subsequent panel discussion open for the whole audience. This event is being recorded and will be published afterwards. As the time schedule is rather tight, I kindly remind the presenters to remain within their time limits given and to avoid speaking from the off during a presentation. I will ring a little bell when there is only 1 minute left to finalize the presentation. And as it is impossible for me to always screen the list of more than 300 participants for raised hands or the chat for questions, we will have a question and answer feature where I kindly ask you to write your questions, indicating the experts to whom the question is addressed, followed by a short and concise question, please. And from now on, the questions can be typed into this Q&A feature, and I will later bring them up in the panel discussion at around 11:30. And in case of any technical problems, you can contact the technician via the chat. And now I'm very pleased to give the word to the EUSTAFOR President, Mr. Reinhard Neft. Please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dear Sverit, Sven-Erik Hammer, dear Professor Bauhus, dear panelists, dear colleagues, dear ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to welcome you on behalf of the European State Forest Association, EUSTAFOR, and the Confederation of the European Forest Owners, CEPF, to this co-organized webinar, How Close to Nature is the Management of European Forests. My name is Reinhard Neft and I am the president of EUSTAFOR. EUSTAFOR represents 36 European state forest management organizations in 25 European countries who sustainably manage about 30% of the EU forests. That are 49 million hectares. Since the year 2005, I have also been the managing director of the Bavarian State Forest Enterprise, the largest forest enterprise in Germany. Before we continue this webinar, please allow me to say a few words about the current political situation in Europe. We, and let me speak on behalf of the entire European forestry community, are considering the development of the conflict in the Ukraine with deep sorrow and concern. Our solidarity, our deepest sympathy and special thoughts go to the Ukrainian people and our fellow forests in these difficult times. This is the moment to further strengthen a unit European and international cooperation. We must act together in a solution-oriented way. Coming back to our webinar, EUSTAFOR, together with the umbrella organization of private forest owners, CEPF, would like to give even more attention to the importance of forests and their management in meeting the EU climate and biodiversity objectives enshrined in the EU Green Deal. Forests have been targeted as the main land use sector to allow the EU to achieve its ambitious 2050 objectives. But unfortunately, the newly developed EU forest-related policies and legislations lack on proper understanding of sustainable and multifunctional forest management. The evidence provided by EUSTAFOR members confirms that European state forests have been managed according to strict sustainability rules embedded in national forest legislation for decades. Natural ecosystem processes are followed by daily management practices in state forests. In a nutshell, sustainable forest management and wood production is and must be an important part of the solution regarding climate change. First, by providing timber as a construction material. Second, by delivering sustainable energy, replacing fossil fuels. And third, as a resource for bioeconomy. Instead of restrictions, multi-purpose sustainable forest management should be enhanced as a bio-based solution to the multiple challenges we face today, including climate adaptation, and to increase the health, resilience and vitality of forests across the EU. I am sure that this webinar, which is bringing together excellent speakers from different regions across Europe with a very rich and diverse audience, is an important step towards building a common understanding and finding an answer to how close to nature the management of European forests can be. Thank you for your enormous participations, more than 300, and I'm looking forward to listen to the speakers and the debate with all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Neff, for your welcoming words. And we will now continue right away with Professor Jürgen Bauhus to set the scene concerning challenges to integrate climate change mitigation, adaptation, and biodiversity conservation in European forests. Professor Bauhus is Professor of Silviculture at the Faculty of Environment and Natural Resources at the University in Freiburg in Germany, and his research focuses on the dynamics and the management of structure and composition of forests, the ecological function of biodiversity, carbon and nutrient cycles, as well as the adaptation of forests to global change. Professor Bauhus, the floor is now yours, please.
Thank you very much for this nice introduction and also for the opportunity to speak to you. I hope you can all see the screen well. As you can see in the title of my presentation, I'm aiming to pick up some of the keywords that have been mentioned already, namely the important forest policy discourse issues, mitigation, adaptation, and biodiversity conservation. Some of you may be surprised that wood and timber production is not specifically mentioned in this title. To me, this is part of the mitigation and also a strong purpose for adaptation. So I will discuss this implicitly with these other issues. And these three things are combined in the concept of climate smart forestry, which aims to increase carbon storage, not only in forests, but also in wood products, in conjunction with the provision of other ecosystem services and the conservation of biodiversity. So you could say it's not just climate smart, but also biodiversity smart. But it also aims at enhancing the forest resilience and adaptive capacity through active forest management and for the sustainable use of wood resources as a substitute for non-renewable and carbon-intensive materials. And in my talk, I aim to analyze with you to what extent this can be achieved with closer to nature forest management, the concept that is being discussed at the moment. As a team of a dozen or so scientists from different parts of Europe, we have been commissioned by the European Forest Institute to write a paper from policy to practice on this issue of closer to nature forest management. And some of the things I will be presenting to you is from this paper, where we basically discussed what kind of principles should be part of a concept of closer to nature forest management. And this includes the retention of habitat trees and special habitats and dead wood, promoting native tree species as well as site-adapted non-native species, natural regeneration, the use of partial harvests and promotion of stand structural heterogeneity, promoting tree species mixtures and genetic diversity, the avoidance of intensive management operations, and the support of landscape heterogeneity and functioning. The paper is currently under review, and I hope it will be available in the coming weeks. In this working group, we basically perceive closer to nature forest management as an umbrella concept that covers a number of different approaches and names that have been used for this, such as continuous cover forestry or disturbance-based ecosystem management, which are all basically under the general framework of sustainable forest management and support, resilience, adaptation, and biodiversity conservation, among other things. One could think here of a more detailed list, but these were the main principles that we focused on in our paper. Let me start with the first aspect. Yeah. How does closer to nature forest management address pressures on biodiversity? So we have identified a number of pressures that are internal to forestry, such as harvesting of old forests and old or dead trees, clear cutting with the extraction of old trees, the conversion of natural forests and habitat types, and the use of certain non-native or poorly adapted species, dense forests with high growing stocks, and the abandonment of traditional forest management approaches. Those that are colored in green here are basically issues that can be addressed in a positive way. So remedied through closer to nature forest management. Those are listed in red here, may actually be not properly addressed by closer to nature forest management. And I'll pick these up. There are, of course, also external pressures such as climate change, landscape fragmentation, high populations of large herbivores, which is partially an external and internal pressure, eutrophication through excess nitrogen deposition, and biological invasions, and the impacts of surrounding land use, say drift of agrochemicals, for example, into the forests. And this, the only issue there that can be actually picked up by closer to nature forest management is, of course, the control of population of large herbivores. But as you can see, there are a lot of external pressures also on biodiversity in forests that cannot be really addressed with management. How about this issue of high carbon stocks? There's a very nice study by Sabatini et al. That shows the influence of above ground carbon stocks, to see in this top left panel here, on multidiversity. And so this is an index of the diversity of a number of taxonomic groups ranging from lichens, via fungi, birds, plants, beetles, and bryophytes. And what you can see is that there's basically no relationship. And the underlying reason for that is that, for each of these taxonomic groups, you have some species that benefit from high carbon stocks and others that are negatively affected by high carbon stocks. So there is obviously a trade-off also with some of the mitigation goals. And this is supported by other studies, for example, this one that also looked at the species richness in different groups, animals, plants, and fungi, along successional sequences in the Bavarian Forest National Park. And what we see there is that the richness of species of particular animals and plants is very high in the early successional stages that are characterized by light and also the availability of deadwood, and then later successional stages, which are characterized also by more open conditions and deadwood resources. And both of these are obviously quite important. And this also supports other studies that have found that at the landscape scale, the richness of species is highest when we have a mosaic of these different successional stages, and not so much forests that are only kept in these intermediate successional stages. Also, in support of this idea, are the results that from a study that we carried out here in Baden-Württemberg, where we looked at indices of structural diversity of forests that we could derive from national forest inventories. And this index is composed of a number of variables, which you see listed here. They range from the quadratic mean diameter, its standard deviation of height in the trees in the forest, species richness of trees in the regeneration, the diversity of different bark types from smooth bark to rough bark trees, the diversity, excuse me, the mouse is too sensitive, the diversity of flowering and fruiting types, the volume of large trees greater 40 centimeters dBH, the mean dimension of standing deadwood, of down deadwood, and the number of decay classes. So all variables that are important for providing certain habitat resources. And when you see how these variables change with the intensity of harvesting, which is expressed here as a percent of timbers or for biomass stocks removed related to the previous stocks at the National Forest Inventory in 2002, you see that for a large range of these harvesting intensities, all these variables do actually not decline. Many are actually supported. only at very high harvesting intensities do we see a decline in large trees and the average diameter of trees, in a significant way. What that means is that we basically, with regards to carbon stocks for the purpose of biodiversity conservation and management intensity, we have a relatively wide, safe operating space. And these figures here basically represent the standard management in the state of Baden-Württemberg. What that also means is that for the conservation of biodiversity, we need both. We need less management in some cases to accumulate dead trees or dead wood, as you see in the left, but we also need more management on the other side to support species that are more light demanding and require open conditions such as capercaillies or nightjars or vipers. And what close to nature forest management can do, I think, is quite well pictured in this conceptual graph by the colleague Bollmann from Switzerland, who said that, or who basically depicted close to nature forest management in the context of other goals that are typically followed by nature conservation, namely permitting natural dynamics, strict reservation or restoration. And it can cover a broad range of that, but of course not the specific ones. But it may serve as a good basic approach for large forest areas. Let me come to the next point. How does close to nature forest management support resistance, resilience, and adaptive capacity? So when we look at these principles, we can basically say that all these principles here again that are listed in green would support this resistance, resilience, and adaptive capacity. So, the fact that we have advanced regeneration that can respond following disturbance, or tree species and genetic diversity that ensure that not all species are affected in the same way and have a broader, basically, variation of responses to stress and disturbances is extremely important. What I think requires certainly more research is this question, how we can respond with close to nature approaches to the massive damages that we have experienced in Europe, as you can see here on this picture for the southern Black Forest, where we're trying to find out how these legacies, such as high stumps or slash left on the ground, can actually facilitate regeneration processes. Natural regeneration may or may not support adaptation. It really depends on the genetic makeup and the species that do regenerate in certain conditions. So there's likely more planting necessary. The focus on large trees that is imminent in many forms of close to nature forest management is a bit of a problem, because we have seen that in particular large trees are vulnerable to effects of climate change, that is in particular drought and subsequent disturbances through bark beetles. And here too, high level of growing stocks can be problematic, as I will show in a moment. So mixtures are a very important component of close to nature forest management. And what we see is that in most cases, mixing trees increases the resilience. As we see here for burnt pine oak forest in Portugal, but the pines may be killed, but the oaks can resprout. Here in this situation, when large trees are toppled over, the young ones are already there and can respond to release. Or in this case, where all spruce have died from bark beetles, but we still have a forest and a forest climate. Mixing could also, of course, occur at the landscape level effect, where you have monocultures of different species. You would still have a portfolio effect because they would not all be affected the same way. But the question that we also have to ask is whether beyond this, we have a mixing effect. So where the species that are planted in mixture are more resilient or resistant than they would be when they are planted in monoculture. And here we can see that we have these beneficial effects, certainly for specialized herbivores or for specialized pathogens, and also in most cases with regard to drought stress. The evidence for fire or storm is less clear here. And we have much less evidence for the benefits of structural diversity for the resistance. For the resilience, it's important, as I've shown in this picture here. Let's have a short look at large level of growing stock. We have experienced massive disturbances in Europe recently. And this study of Forestry et al. Is interesting because it tried to look at the drivers of vulnerability of forests, not only in terms of climate and landscape, but also forest inherent drivers. And it identified for these different disturbance agents, fire, wind throw, and insects, that biomass and stand density in the case of fire, tree age and biomass in the case of wind throw, or leaf area index and biomass are actually important predictors for the vulnerability of forests. This is, of course, in addition to species attributes. It has also been found that some of our conifer species, in particular spruce, are particularly vulnerable, of course, to this kind of disturbances. So storing very high amounts of carbon in forests also increases the risks to disturbances, and that needs to be considered. Let me move to the question, how does close to nature forest management support climate change mitigation? Again, we have these principles here, which you're now already familiar with. And again, all these green ones, they basically support climate change mitigation because they also support the adaptive capacity. And anything that helps to adapt forests to future climate would also support the future mitigation potential. Whether natural regeneration does that depends on the species and genetic makeup of natural regeneration. Again, the focus on large trees is indifferent. Large trees may lead to more long-lived wood products in the use, but they also have this increased vulnerability, and we've covered this point already. I think generally one would have to say that the strategy to store carbon in forests provides mainly benefits until the sink is saturated, and I think in some countries of Europe we are close to that. Maybe there are theoretically higher levels, but we have to see what the levels, achievable levels, are really in the context of the disturbances that we have to face. And it ignores the trade-offs between biodiversity and other ecosystem functions. This strategy is not free from risks, as I've just shown you, and it may also inhibit adaptation when we think of the tree species that we need in future, many of which are more light demanding. And of course, it neglects the urgent need to decarbonize the global economy. And when we see that projections for the global resource extraction for biomass, fossil fuels, and metal ores and minerals by 2050 are associated with increases in greenhouse gas emissions of approximately 40%, it would certainly be not wise from a holistic and sustainability point of view to exclude here the use of renewable energy from forests, which are the most important non-feed, non-food land use type. Let me come to another aspect, and that is the question of close to nature forest management in the forest landscapes. I think most, even forest ecologists, would agree that sustainable forest management relies on 3 pillars. We need strict reserves to conserve certain aspects of biodiversity. And we also need some forms of intensive forestry to actually meet the demand for this renewable resource. And in between, we often have forestry that is labeled here closer to nature forest management. In other areas, it's ecoforestry, you name it. And the idea is that we can have different levels of integration or segregation of these different land use forms by moving here this line in different directions. But what we see happening in Europe at the moment is that we're increasing natural forests. We're also increasing this closer to nature forests. And as a result, we are at the same time decreasing the area, what is here called forest plantations. You could also call it the area of more intensive forest management. So it runs contradictory to this principle of finding a balance between these different kinds of forest management intensity. And the question is whether this is an honest approach to the challenges that we face for the future. I just want to throw out this example here from an analysis that has been done by Matthias Dieter from the Thünen Institute that tried to analyze the consequences of the EU biodiversity strategy for future wood supply in the EU. And the result for the year 2050, you can see here as a difference between a reference scenario and the EU biodiv scenario, where it is assumed that we have 10% strict reserves, 30% protected areas, and protection of all old growth. Now, we could discuss the assumptions underlying these scenarios. I don't agree with all of them, but that is not important at the moment. What it shows is that basically in their exercise, they arrive at the conclusion that about 73% of this gap that we will have will be covered by imports. And these are, of course, leakage effects with regards to biodiversity, with regards to carbon, etc. And in my view, this raises important questions, ethical ones, but also strategic ones, when you see from which countries some of these imports would be obtained. A last question that I want to address is that who will actually carry out all this adaptation, mitigation, and biodiversity conservation? And this question is particularly important in Europe, where we have 60% of private forests and where a lot of these forest owners are also suffering from the effects of climate change. So far, and these are figures for Germany, but I bet they're not that much different in your countries, more than 90% of the income of forest owners comes from selling timber, and very little from income to provide these services such as mitigation or biodiversity conservation. And they face a situation that their income under climate change will likely be reduced through more frequent disturbances, which leads to less utilizable timber, market distortion, loss of assets, reduced productivity, shift to economically less profitable species, increasing retention levels, etc. At the same time, they face many increasing costs. So what we need to take for that is that if we want these forest owners to achieve all that, they require support, financial as well as technical. Let me come to conclusions and recommendations. I believe that closer to nature forest management certainly has the potential to serve many aspects of carbon smart forestry while supporting biodiversity. So it functions within the landscape probably very well as a basic approach. to meet the challenges of supporting these climate change mitigation, adaptation, biodiversity conservation. However, we require a modern and flexible interpretation of what actually is close to nature forest management. So it needs to include variable retention, habitat trees and deadwoods. It needs to embrace disturbances as a force that shapes forests. It needs to consider assisted migration and also planting, but also adapted target diameters and carbon stocks, as well as landscape approaches. So in that sense, it may be a bit different from sort of traditional concepts of close to nature forest management. The trade-offs that there are between these different goals and other ecosystem services, they need to be considered to avoid negative feedbacks and also to avoid leakage effects. Yeah? And the implementation requires, as I said, much technical support and financial support, in particular for small private forest owners, for the provision of ecosystem services. And this is where we need to move to. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Bauhus, for this very interesting presentation. Great overview. And please allow me a first related question. So the integrated network demonstrates, the Integrate Network project demonstrates since 6 years examples on the integration of nature conservation into sustainable forest management in 20 member countries. And what are some key lessons to be learned from this process for forest management with regard to a closer to nature approach?
I think the Integrate project showed that there can be many different ways to achieve these outcomes. And of course, there is no one-size-fits-all solution for this. It really depends on the starting conditions and the consideration of these key principles, which I've basically outlined also here. So some forethinkers and protagonists of this Integrate project have also been part of this study that has been commissioned by the European Forest Institute on this policy paper, from science to policy paper on close to nature forest management. Yeah. So there wasn't a discussion initially also, why do we need this now? We have already Integrate. And of course, we need this now because it's been discussed in Brussels as an approach. But I think that the congruence between this Integrate approaches and a sort of modern, more holistic approach of closer to nature forest management, according to the principles I've shown here, the congruence is very high. Yeah. One thing which may require some discussion is to what extent some more historical forms of forest management, such as coppice or coppice with standards, whether they should also be regarded as a form of closer to nature forest management. There's certainly a form of integrative forest management.
Okay, so thank you very much for these insights into the Integrate network. And now I'm inviting all the panelists to contribute with further related presentations. And I also encourage all participants to write questions to Professor Bauhus and then also to the following panelists in the Q&A feature. Please write there to whom the question is addressed and then a short and concise question. And now I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Andrej Talacic. He is the president of the Forest and Natural Resources Research Center Foundation and the Research and Development Director at Taxus IT in Poland. And he has very rich experience in forest management planning and information technologies, as well as in creating key national level forest policy support tools, including national forest inventories and forest data banks. Andrej Talacic, you have the floor now.
Thank you, Stephanie. Good morning, everyone. Okay, here is the presentation. It's a pleasure to take part in this webinar. I want to apologize for my voice, but I will try to tell you very shortly about what we can learn from international statistics on European forests. There are several places we can look for statistics of forests at the international level. The first is the Global Forest Resources Assessment. This is a long-running process of collecting information on forests done globally. Another important source is the Pan-European set of criteria and indicators for sustainable forest management. There are also some forest and biodiversity related data collected by Eurostat. An important source are biodiversity assessments produced by the European Environment Agency and other EU agencies. Another long-running process of gathering valuable data on forests and their utilization is the work of the UNECE, United Nations Economic Commission for Europe. And last but not least, there are national initiatives like national forest inventories and monitoring processes, which, if harmonized, can serve also as an important information source at the international level. When we look at forest statistics, we usually start with some general, most popular indicators. Absolute numbers give a general outlook of the subject of analysis, but if we look at trends, we can infer some conclusions on sustainability. Looking at the European Union, we can see that we are talking about 38% of its area taken up by forests. The general situation is stable. The area has been steadily increasing, forest area, as well as the age and growing stock. At the same time, the timber harvest remains below the increment, which gives a strong hint that forest management in Europe is done sustainably. To understand the situation regarding biodiversity, we would optimally need some direct indicators, which would allow us to measure levels of biodiversity. Unfortunately, this is methodologically, technically, and financially quite a demanding task. So in reality, there are not too many such indicators. We have the Common Forest Bird Species Index, which has been stable for the past 40 years, and it shows that forest bird populations are much less adversely affected in time than, for example, farmland bird species. Other indicators, such as the IUCN Red List and monitoring of non-bird species, which are protected under the Habitat Directive, lack consistent methodology and uniform coverage. For this reason, proxy indicators are very important to get insight into the situation regarding biodiversity. You can see several of them here. They address certain forest characteristics which are known to be linked to biodiversity. For example, deadwood, forest habitats, or others which reflect internal or external pressures which might be negatively affecting biodiversity. Many of them give a strong hint that forest management in the EU is done sustainable and support improving biodiversity in our forests. When we look at the level of naturalness, tree species composition, protected forest areas, we can see positive trends. There are several examples where there is a need for improvement. Deadwood, for example, is still a bit below what is currently considered optimal. Most of stands are still even aged. In some regions, there are significant amounts of atmospheric depositions. The climate change has also been taking its increasing toll and causing new pressures on biodiversity. We are all aware of current negative dynamics regarding biodiversity in general. When we look at forests, we can also identify many drivers, both internal, related to forestry, and external, Some of them are significant in the European context, others are more significant in other geographic regions. Looking at the European forests, the observed biodiversity decline drivers are mainly external pressures. We observe increasing growing stocks and removals, but this is linked with increasing age, and the utilization rate is around 70% of the increment. The biggest external pressure is climate change. A significant one are still atmospheric depositions and drift of pesticides from agriculture. On the other hand, pressure on forest area from agriculture is not significant. It is actually, in many countries, the trend is opposite. Anyway, we need better understanding of several factors, and for that, we need new or improved indicators and monitoring protocols and techniques. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Andre, for these very interesting insights. But how can national forest inventories or other field data then be better integrated and used in international statistics, that they can then subsequently be properly used in EU policymaking?
National forest inventories have become de facto standard in how countries acquire information on the forest resources, their condition and trends, at least in Europe. However, we must remember that the NFIs are purely national undertakings, and as such, they are designed to respond primarily to national needs and circumstances. For them to be useful in the international context, inventory results must be harmonized. It would be ideal to harmonize the NFI methods used by different countries, but for various reasons, this doesn't seem feasible at the moment. But what could be done is to develop harmonized definitions and conversion procedures, which would allow for presenting data gathered by individual countries in a common way. Another important factor, in my opinion, is linking traditional forest inventory approaches based on plot sampling with new technologies, such as remote sensing. Both approaches have their advantages and disadvantages. Some things are better and more efficient, observed from above, with increasingly sophisticated techniques. But there are other parameters for which ground observation cannot be replaced. For instance, several biodiversity indicators. So clearly there are synergies that could be achieved by combining ground measurements with remote sensing, which we should just avoid thinking that either of the approaches is superior to the other. It's also important to make sure the information is comparable. Recently, we have analyzed in the paper that Stefanie and I, we are both co-authors, how well the pan-European criteria and indicators for sustainable forest management correspond to the objectives of the new European forest strategy. We have found out that about 2/3 of the identified objectives and commitments in the strategy can be monitored, at least partially, by the pan-European set of indicators. But new indicators or approaches are needed for the remaining 1/3. So clearly, there are several issues in the strategy which are not fully covered in the pan-European set. In general, we are experiencing changes in many aspects linked to forestry: climate change, related events such as forest damages, changes in water availability, changing social attitudes and political priorities. And all this must be reflected in new or modified ways we collect information on forests.
Yeah, thank you, Andre, for sharing this very interesting information. So our next speaker now is Professor Tudor Tansioi, who is a professor of forest ecology and forest dynamics at the Transylvania University of Brașov in Romania. And his work is focused on forest dynamics, species-habitat relationships, sustainable forest management, and on certification. And his contribution will focus on whether to follow active protection or passive conservation. So Professor Stan Siwi, the floor is now yours, please.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you for the invitation at this interesting meeting. In the next minutes, I will try to give a short or a brief introduction to the interesting and challenging topic of conserving biodiversity at large scales. And I would start by asking why the large scale is the only way. Because forests are dynamic. They do change in time, whether we like it or not, and they do change in time with us or without us. So that means that the habitat for species will change in that place. And we do have species with different needs. So what is now good for a species might not be in the future because of natural change or management-driven change. So if biodiversity is changing in time and no place has all the species, how to deal with these changes? Well, we need large scale, but not only the size is important, but also the structure. And of course, first of all, we need to move away from the myth that all the species are dependent only on the old forest. And whatever happens to that old forest is the end of it. Because we do have many species in reality that depend on other stages, actually, as Professor Bauhaus also said. And we do have many species that depend in the same time on more than one stage for feeding or hiding or thermal cover. So no stage has all the species and each stage is important. And again, all of them are needed for the large scale and high biodiversity. So how to conserve the highest biodiversity? Well, it is, having the large scale landscapes, but landscapes which are a mosaic, a shifting steady state mosaic, always having all stages of development inside. Even if in time, the place of a certain stage will move, of course, because the forest evolves in that place. So these will offer not only habitat for all species, but also good connectivity, which is a condition for high biodiversity. What are the implications? Well, if we want to have that very large size, European size or national size, including managed forest land is not an option. What does that mean is that coexistence is the only way, and I think represents the natural way in most of Europe. The humans were here for millennia and shaped the land. For the diverse structures, so not only for the size, but for having the diversity of structures, we need various types of disturbances with regular frequency. And therefore, we should ask ourselves if active conservation is just optional. So which way to go? Active or passive conservation? Well, active conservation means, nature with humans, something which is natural in Europe indeed. It gives the only chance for the large scale we want or we need for a high biodiversity. It also gives the only chance for appropriate connectivity and is the only chance to control the structure of that landscape. So it gives us the best chances for a more or less balanced, shifting, steady state landscape mosaic with all the stages in it. On the other hand, passive conservation is nature without us. Well, that's not necessarily very natural in Europe and is not always something nice looking, but beyond that, it doesn't give a chance for very large scale that we need. And because of that, it doesn't give a real chance for good connectivity. By reducing the coexistence, it's shifting the burden on the rest of the forest. And it doesn't give that good chance for controlling the structure of the landscape. It leaves that structure to the natural disturbances. But they will do it their way, not our way, definitely. When they want, the way they want. Yes, indeed, it does protect primary and true old-growth forests, but it is protecting them from humans, not from a change. So overall, the chance is much lower to have that more or less balanced shifting steady state landscape, which would ensure a high biodiversity. So what to do? Well, definitely a combination of both is probably better, but then the proportion of each becomes important for practical implementation. And taking into account the very important things about size and connectivity and structure, I think we will be more efficient and effective if we'll invest our efforts more into doing active conservation, covering very large areas with what is needed for biodiversity, rather than doing passive conservation, or even increasing the area of passive conservation up to 10%. Thank you for your attention.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you very much, Professor Stanziui, for pointing out both options in detail. The European Commission is, however, aiming to strictly protect all remaining old-growth forests. And given natural competition and ongoing climate change, is non-intervention now the best management option for all old-growth forests?
Well, the answer would be simple, but it's not that simple because I have seen many or different definitions for these forests. So I think, first of all, we should define them. Nowadays, I've seen, for example, many times old growth is misinterpreted as old, but managed forest for a long rotation. And yes, if we compare this kind of a forest to a very intensive short rotation plantation, yes, it looks really old and really big, and we might misinterpret it as old growth. But I mean, old growth, true old growth means a phase when the trees are dying because they reached senescence. Okay, and that age for our main species like oaks or spruce or beech in Europe, it's way over 300 years old. So if we define them as forests that are 300 or 400 years old or more, I think we can protect them because we don't obtain that by management. But we should offer incentives to owners, definitely. If we define them the other way, that the forests that were meant for a long rotation now should become strictly protected, I think this is wrong. And it is wrong not only because that would mean punishing people that were embracing a long rotation. It is wrong because it will mean lowering the rotation in the rest of the forests. Forests that will never reach that stage. And that is not good for biodiversity reasons. It might be good for economic reasons. So those managed forests, if we like them, if we believe they are good, I'm not saying they're not good. I think they're very good for biodiversity. We should not strictly protect them, but actually give money and incentives to the owners that are doing that kind of management to stimulate that kind of management, not stop that kind of management. So I think we should protect, as a conclusion, the true old growth forest.
Thank you. Thank you for these clear explanations. So the next panelist presentation will be from Professor Dorota Dobrowolska from the Department of Forest Ecology at the Forest Research Institute in Sekostary in Poland. And her research covers silviculture, forest ecology, and forest protection. And her main field of focus is forest disturbance dynamics in managed and protected forest stands, with an emphasis on forest regeneration and on the application of close to nature forest management in Poland. And she will now talk about how far is the current management practice from close or closer to nature forestry in Central Eastern Europe. Professor Dobrowolska, the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, for your presentation. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for the invitation for the very interesting webinar. And today I would like to say more about Polish state forests. And is it possible to join the current management practices with the close or closer to nature forestry in Europe? Today, Professor Bauchus presented the main principles of the closer to nature forestry. So I choose some of them because I also participated in the guidelines. So what is more important principle of the closer to nature forestry is the retention of habitat, trees, and dead wood. We also should promote the native tree species. I think that it is important that we should promote natural regeneration of tree species. And also, it is very important to promote tree species variation and the genetic diversity. The intensive management operation should be avoided. And I think that partial harvest and promotion of structural variation is also very important. And I think that all of them are also the part of the sustainable forest management. And on the second slide, I would like to show you how we in Poland try to join those principles coming from sustainable forest management and closer to nature forestry. So in last year, the forest cover increased in our country. With the increment of forest cover, we observe also the increase in stand age. You can see that nowadays, currently, the mean stand age is 64 years. Also, the growing stock of our forests increased, and now it's almost 269 cubic meter per hectare. We also concentrate in increasing the share of deciduous tree species, because in Poland, the main tree species still is Scots pine. However, we understood that the increase of deciduous tree species is very important. Leaving the dead wood, the standing and lying dead wood is also important part of Polish forestry. And you can see that from 2009 until 2021, the volume of dead wood left in the forest is 9.4 cubic meter per hectare. Also, Poland is a specific country where artificial regeneration is very often used. However, we think that we also should increase the share of natural regeneration, and nowadays it's almost 17% of area where we can find natural regeneration. Gene protection is also a very important issue, and in our country nowadays we have 174,000 hectares of seed stands. And also the forest management. Of course, we have to remember that biodiversity is very important, but also the forest management should be carried out in state forests for the wood timber demand. So in this graph, I present how the forest management is carried out in the period from 2005-2021. And I present the clear cutting, which is much less than the complex forest management. in some, because of the climate change and the disturbances like windfall, so sometimes the area of clear cut increased, like in 2018, when we observed in our country a lot of damages caused by wind throw. So I would like to thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Dobrowolska, for this interesting presentation on Polish forest management. And please also allow me one ad hoc question. The current forest management is being challenged at the moment by some part of the general public. And how accurate are these concerns, and what could be done to address them?
Thank you. It is true that forest management is being challenged by the public. The society criticized the results of forest interventions, especially clear cutting, piles of timber left in the forest, usage of harvest, like in the Białowieża forest. But the only way to change public's opinion is to share the information about forest management, not generally, but also locally. So the state forests have just prepared a few guidelines how to cooperate with the public. And the first document, which is already prepared, is called the Principles of Public Participation in the Management Planning Processes. The aim of social participation in the forest planning process should be the acceptance of activities and the quality of supervision over state-owned forests. It is assumed that this will reduce potential misunderstanding and conflicts, and what is very important, will increase public awareness of forest management and the role of forests. The second very important document, in my opinion, which also can improve the communication between foresters and public, is the guidelines for forest management in urbanized area on land managed by state forests. This document is also prepared and it will be issued in a few weeks. So I think that the growing importance of forests in urbanized areas creates the need to properly shape the environmental protection policy and requires modification of the method of managing forest resources. Currently, forest management based on the principle of rotation compromise between forest functions requires extensive knowledge, but also a non-schematic approach to managing each stand. I think that such rules like proper organization of work in the field of timber harvesting and skidding, the location, proper location of timber far away from parking areas, which are viewpoints, is also important. And all the management should be done not during the touristic, let's say, time, but maybe in the winter or when the recreation area are not so often visited by public. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Dobrowolska, for these insights and the information. And now I'm delighted to introduce Professor Tiago Domingos to you. He is an associate professor in environment and energy at the University of Lisbon in Portugal, and coordinates the interdepartmental platform for environmental science and engineering. His main area of research his main areas are ecological economics and ecological modeling. And today he's addressing multifunctionality versus segregation of functions. So Professor Domingos, you have the floor now, please.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for the invitation to be here, and hello to everybody. Let me just share my screen. And so as Stephanie just said, this is what I'll be talking about, multifunctionality versus segregation of functions. And it's going to be a Portuguese case study. It's based on this EcoPol project that my university carried out with several partners, but namely a forest association in Portugal, which is a member of your associations, UNAC, the Mediterranean Forest Association. And our case study is based on the well-known Portuguese agroforestry system called Montado and called the HESA in Spain. And you have here in my first slide just a picture of what we're talking about. So this the Montado is an agroforestry system which is based on cork oak and holm oak, and here you see the cork oak, and which has had its cork bark taken in 2021, hence the one over there. So this is an agroforestry system that nowadays combines the forests with a small number of trees per area, say 60 trees per hectare, and then you have grazing. And you have animals grazing, which would either be sheep or cattle, or it could be pigs, giving the famous Iberian pig ham. It comes from this system. And obviously the cork that comes from here is the cork that we all get in our wine bottles, but which also has increasing uses as insulation and as an alternative bio-renewable based material for multiple situations, given its very interesting mechanical and thermal and other characteristics. So what we did in this EcoPol project is that we made a systematic literature review, so covering all the available scientific literature, comparing the ecosystem service outcomes of having a Montado agroforestry system versus the alternative land uses. And that is what you can see. Here in this slide, which is the systems that were compared in this project. And so we have centrally, our reference system is this scenario B2, which is what I've been telling you about. It's the grazed Montado. It's based on cork oak, holm oak, and in fact other oaks like Pyrenean oak. We have extensive grazing with 0.1 to 0.5 livestock units per hectare. And this maintains a grassland understory, and it's what we call an agroforestry management. We have an alternative situation, which we call the ungrazed Montado. This is no longer a purely what you would exactly call a Montado, because now you have no grazing. And so the understory is now no longer grassland, it's shrubland. And so it's a pure forestry system. But in many points of view, it's still similar to the other one. And that's why we combine them both as scenarios B. And now we compare this to two alternative situations that may occur and do occur in Portugal, and I think also in Spain, but our study is focused on Portugal, which is you may have, and that's here you have a gradient of management intensity. And so coming to the left, we have the situation of abandonment. This occurs especially in the hillier areas of southern and central Portugal, where anyway this system exists. And there you lose the trees and you're left just with the shrublands. You have no grazing and no management. At the opposite extreme in terms of management intensity, you have the situation of grazing intensification, frequently driven by incentives from the Common Agricultural Policy, perverse incentives from the Common Agricultural Policy, as we will see in a moment. And there what you start getting is an intensive management in the sense that you get higher grazing intensity. This higher grazing intensity becomes incompatible with regeneration of trees, of the cork oaks and the holm oaks. It also leads to soil degradation that is also harmful to the trees. And so as time goes by, you will the trees die out and you're left just with simply natural grasslands, maybe sown, but essentially you're left with grasslands, no trees any longer. Just a comment here, when going from the scenarios B1 and B2 to the scenario A, the situation of abandonment leads typically to the loss of the trees through fire. So with no longer any active management, you have this accumulation of fuel, and this, especially under Mediterranean conditions, this accumulation of fuel leads to uncontrolled fires, and it is through those fires that the trees are lost, and that's why we get the problem in the end. So based on our systematic review, we covered all the services you see here: carbon sequestration, nutrient cycling, erosion control, water balance, pollination, fire risk, landscape aesthetics, a series of indicators of biodiversity, including the conservation of emblematic species, where we focus on one particular species, which is the Iberian lynx, which is a species close to extinction. In this table here, you see the comparison between the scenarios. So we take B2 as our reference scenario, the Montado with active management using grazing, and it's taken the reference with the green cross. We can first see the comparison with the situation of a Montado, which is structurally the same in terms of trees, but where there is no grazing, and so there is no management of the shrubland cover. We see that in several situations, it's just as good as the other one. And in fact, even in one particular case, which is soil macrofauna diversity, it's better. We see that it is critically worse in one particular issue, which is the fire risk, because now without the grazing, we have a much higher fuel load. And it is also worse in terms of pollination. And then there are several indicators on either the effect is ambiguous because there's literature pointing in one direction and the other, and there are situations where simply there is no literature. Now let's go to the more extreme situations: abandonment with loss of the trees. And what we see is that that is overwhelmingly negative, and just with one situation where it's positive, which is bird diversity. And let's go to the opposite end of the gradient in terms of management, which is where there are, again, no trees because we now have heavy grazing. And we see that, again, it is overwhelmingly negative, with just one thing in which it is better, which is the hydrological cycle. And the issue here is that the system with the Montado, you have higher evapotranspiration because you have both the trees and the grassland and the shrubs transpiring, and especially the trees are transpiring during summer, something which doesn't happen if you just have the grasses. And so in terms of resupply of subterranean water tables, that's the only issue in which having the open grasslands is better. And so overall, what our systematic literature review showed us is that overwhelmingly these are central scenarios in terms of having this multifunctional Montado system, providing the cork, providing the milk and the meat from the animals, having the fuel load controlled by the grazing is overwhelmingly better compared to the alternative situations of no management, abandonment, and fire, or excessive grazing and loss of the multifunctional system. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Domingos, for this very interesting presentation. But Portugal is one of the most at-risk countries when it comes to wildfires. And may I ask you if you think that fire risk management and the desire for increasing amounts of deadwood can be reconciled?
Okay, so thank you for that question. So Portugal, forest-wise, Portugal is divided into two big regions, let's call it the south and the interior, which is dry and very Mediterranean, and which is where this system that I've been mentioning is implemented, the Montado. And the interesting thing to mention about the Montado is that it occurs in the most fire-prone risks of Portugal, but those are the areas of Portugal with less fires. And it is because exactly of this grazing and this reduced fuel load. Now, in the northern center, we have the forest, let's call it the pure forest systems of mostly pine and eucalyptus. And it is to those that your concern about the dead wood would apply, because in fact, it is in those that we've been having the massive fires that you have, or that, namely we had the massive fires a few years ago that you all heard of, and that we have the very high risk, the very high fire risk. Naturally, there's the reduction of this fire risk fire risk in those forests is reduced if you have active management. For example, eucalyptus plantations are very controversial in Portugal now. We now have 800,000 hectares of those, so they are the dominant forest use, and they are, let's call it the most intensive forest use. So they're explored in a rotation, a 12-year rotation, where the wood is then used for the pulp and paper industry. The first thing to say about, and I'm going to get to the deadwood, but the point is that I want to emphasize that before getting to the deadwood, for this eucalyptus forests, and even comparing it to the pine forest, the first central measure of fire risk is whether the forest is adequate as a wood-producing forest for pulp and paper. That the first central difference in fire risk is whether the forest is correctly managed or not. So the area which is managed directly by the pulp and paper companies has very low fire risk because it is adequately managed, but the predominant area of eucalyptus has a large fire risk because it is not adequately managed. It is there's no fuel load control, there's no adequate control of regeneration, and so this is a major fire risk compared to what might be a fire risk associated to deadwood. So of course, if you start having deadwood all over the system, that would be an increased fire risk. So I would say the answer to that, which is, I think, has been a recurring answer this morning, is the issue of the mosaic. Yes, you can have deadwood, but you have to manage it adequately at the landscape scale, where you'd have plots where you have deadwood and where you don't. And in any case, above all, if we want to reduce fire risk, we need adequate forest management, and we need the mosaic. And that is, again, the big problem in north and central Portugal, which is having continuous forests, a continuous forest landscape, instead of having an adequate mosaic of the different uses. And that's it.
Thanks. Thank you, Professor Domingos, for your valuable information on these Portuguese conditions and forest management in Portugal. As a final panelist, I'm now welcoming Professor Pasi Rautio, a research professor for silviculture at Luke, the National Resources Institute in Finland. And his work is focusing on forest regeneration and management methods in areas that are facing pressures from other land uses, such as tourism, recreation, and reindeer herding. And he will now talk about how to mimic natural dynamics through management of Nordic forests. Please, Professor Rautio, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. I hope you see the slides. So few examples how we mimic natural dynamics in forest, in our forest management here in northern part of Europe. So basically that concerns the boreal forests. The management regimes that have gained quite much support in past few years is, for example, this kind of small cap openings that you see here in satellite picture. You see here the a small cap opening for that has a diameter of 80 meters and here is 40 meters. What you can't see is the diameter of 20 meters. So this raises the questions that when are you actually talking about the small cap openings and when are you doing a selection cuttings? And this might, of course, sounds a bit semantic, but it's been argued by some researchers, for example, that the small cap openings are just clear cuttings, and that's what they are, of course. But when are you actually creating a gap in the forest? That's a bit not semantic anymore, because the forest owners need to know when are they actually doing a continuous cover forestry. So basically the selection cuttings and small cap openings are quite much cousins. So it's not that clear when you're actually making holes in the forest. That depends on the scale. But in any case, these two methods are now gaining popularity. For example, this one is close to a touristic resort, so trying to reduce the conflicts with touristic entrepreneurs, this kind of methods can be used. What has been used for already quite some time is the retention forestry, and I just took a copy of a presentation by Metsä Group just to show that this is becoming a standard procedure in practical forestry. So what you see here in the center is retention tree group, and typically it is created where you find fallen trees, or you actually might even fall the trees to create a new deadwood. And then it is a quite well known already that the deciduous trees are not only good for biodiversity, but they also improve the stand or the site quality. So all the birches and especially aspens are left to preserve the biodiversity, becoming a deadwood later on, but also to produce the deciduous litter, which is good for the site quality. Biodiversity stumps are created artificially, and standing dying trees are left. So this is quite typical. In the state-owned forest, the standard procedure is to leave one retention forest tree group like this per hectare, and then all the dead wood that are standing are left, as well as deciduous trees nowadays. This is quite standard procedure. But of course, one could then ask that what is this natural dynamics? So in boreal forest, this is very natural dynamic. So basically all our forests have regenerated at some point this way, so by forest fire. And then when this scenery has actually given the idea for clear cuttings and soil preparation. So one could ask for, of course, that are these methods then unnatural, or are they mimicking natural dynamics as well? Clear cutting and soil preparation. Of course, saying this out loud doesn't make any new friends, but of course this needs to be asked in forest science, that what is actually the natural dynamics? Is it just things that we consider as a pleasant scenery, or is it something else than that we have seen in, let's say, hundreds or thousands of years before the present forest management regimes were established? So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Professor Rautio, for this very interesting presentation. But could you please kindly elaborate also a bit on if single species forests are occurring naturally and under which conditions?
Yes, they are. Well, basically, we have only 2 native conifer species, and they live in quite. Sometimes they live in the same places, but many times in quite distinctly different sites. For example, in southern part of Finland, in some places, the pines have really difficult time, even that they would normally live in that site. But the moose browsing pressure is so high that the pines do not have any chances. So basically, what comes there is birches and spruces, but birches disappear as well. The moose are eating them. So the spruce will stay alone for a pretty long time in that kind of sites. The other site type is here in northern part of Finland, where we have a lot of dry sites where spruces have hard time, but pines do just nicely. The pines are accompanied by birches, but here the reindeer grazing pressure is so high that birches are going to be eaten. So the pines are living alone. The real species diversity here in boreal forest is on the ground floor. It's the shrubs and herbs, but especially lichens and mosses that are the backbone of the species diversity.
Thank you, Professor Rautio, and a great thank to all panelists for their valuable contributions as a basis now for the following discussion. And I also would like to thank you for remaining within the time limits given. We are perfectly in time presently. I will open now the floor to questions from the online audience. Please continue to raise your questions in the Q&A feature, and I will receive the questions from there. And I also welcome the panelists to ask questions from each other. To signal that you would have a question, please raise your hand button, but please only the panelists. And there's also a group of EUSTAFOR members participating from the same room in Brussels, as you can see now from the video. And I also ask them to raise your hand button so that I can give you the floor to ask a question. And please, all other participants, use the Q&A feature. And I will start now the discussion with a question from the audience. It was asked by Roland Kautz from the Austrian State Forest, from the ÖBF. He's asking, what is new and or different in the close to nature concept from the yet well-developed and implemented concept of integrated sustainable forest management? And the question is addressed to Jürgen Bauhus, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's, of course, an important question. Sustainable forest management is, of course, the broader umbrella under which closer to nature forest management would sit. So it's a specification of a certain type of sustainable forest management. And I think what makes it more specific is the goal to integrate a large variety of forest management objectives on a smaller spatial scale, and to orient the management of forest composition and structure towards more natural compositions, also considering emulating natural disturbance patterns into management. So it's a specification. Yeah? Under sustainable forest management, we can also manage plantations sustainable, yeah? But they're very different from the envisaged composition and structure in close to nature forest management.
Okay, thank you very much. Next question is to Tudor Stanciui from Anna Sornacki-Luba from the Polish State Forests. From your perspective and knowledge, what should be a minimum size of a forest stand to protect natural processes by a passive conservation? Minimum size.
Well, I don't know if it's that easy to answer. And I've heard numbers like 25 hectares or 50 hectares over the time. But the big question is to protect from what? Because sometimes we believe that if we leave them alone in terms of our management, or if we put a buffer around them, they will remain unchanged. Well, the truth is they don't remain unchanged. And there are also some processes that are somehow related to our activity, like pollution, maybe even the climate change, a pollen that comes from species that are not necessarily natural or reach the place, seeds that could come to that place, exotic insects or fungi or whatever else. So I don't think we could really 100% protect them from all human impact. So I don't answer the question precisely. I don't know precisely what would be the size, but I think it would be I would say, unsuccessful to try to protect them from everything.
Thank you, Tudor. The next question is to Dorota Dobrowolska from Andreas Molz, BUND, Germany. How many forests are strictly protected in Poland? In percent, he wants to know.
In our country, we have some two kinds of reserves: strictly protected and partially protected. In strictly protected area, we couldn't do any interventions. This is area just for observation the natural processes, and all of the strictly and strictly and partially protected area is less than 0.5% of the forested area. So it's not a lot.
Yeah, okay. Very small area.
Very small area.
The next question is from Tamas Sedlak from the European Commission, DG Agri, to Tiago Domingos. The findings on the Portugal study concerning management versions and the fire-related findings should be well communicated. How could this be done, he's asking.
Well, yes, of course, I couldn't agree more that they need to be well communicated. I'd say that, I'd say that this probably operates at two levels. I think that's something that's come up this morning frequently, and which is clearly having a strong, in some cases beneficial, in some cases not beneficial influence on forest management, is public perception. There's a lot of this that's associated to how the public sees this forest management. My view on this is that we have to leverage these positive services that are provided by activity. And so in fact, our own project, I didn't mention that, but I just mentioned the acronym, which is EcoPol, but the full name including inserting the multifunctional narrative about forests, in terms of how inserting multifunctionality into the narrative about these forests. And so I think this is something that we need to communicate to the public in general, with a positive, this positive message that the active management be able to create a narrative around the positive benefits provided by active management.
Thank you, Tiago. Thanks. Next question is addressed to Andre Talacic. It's a combined question from Teresa Baiges, Forest Ownership Center of Catalonia, and Olga van de Weer, Infra-Nature Advice in the Netherlands. And they are asking, when you say there is a need for new indicators, would you include in these indicators to assess the resilience capacity, not only of forests, but also of forest stakeholders? In addition, have you considered recording soil degradation like compaction, decrease of soils life, and acidification?
Thank you very much. Well, I was talking specifically about measuring forest condition and biodiversity. As Professor Bauhaus has shown in his presentation, there is a need to balance passive protection, plantation type forestry, and close to nature forestry. And one of the prerequisites to find the right balance is to reconcile interests of various stakeholders in the forest sector. I have no immediate idea of an indicator to measure resilience capacity. We would have to define it first of forest stakeholders, but definitely we need better indicators to measure economic and social aspects of the forest sector, as obviously this is something to be taken into account when making decisions about it. As to the question about the soil condition, yes, definitely, soil condition and degradation is an important factor, which is underlying forest condition and biodiversity. It is included in the pan-European set of criteria and indicators for sustainable forest management. We know that in Europe, forest cover is stable and actually increasing, and forest management per se is not a major cause for soil degradation, except perhaps some specific cases like eucalyptus plantations, which were shown in one of the presentations. However, we can see increasing pressures on soils from the industry, agriculture, and climate change related events such as fires. So yes, this is something to be monitored as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Andre. Thanks. The next question is addressed to Pasi Raudio. It's a combined question from Teresa Beiges again, from the Forest Ownership Center in Catalonia, and from Martin Jensen, a Swedish consultant for close to nature forestry. And they ask, you mentioned that close to nature has so far been focused in mimicking small natural disturbances, but do you think we are ready to embrace that mimicking nature may also mean mimicking large-scale disturbances? For instance, even-aged management in conifers at landscape scale. And if so, is there a risk of over-disturbed forest ecosystems?
Yeah, well, there is a pressure, of course, to change the present regimes to continuous cover forestry or uneven age forestry. How do you want to label it? But I would say that it totally depends on the species if that's a wise choice or not. We have seen, for example, that selection cuttings in our pine forests are not doing very well, so they regenerate very poorly. In spruce forest, why not? I mean, yeah, you can try. But my point was also in my presentation that one could say that the large openings, clear cuttings, are mimicking the total destructions that we see in nature. So it is not unnatural, I would say. I'm not sure if I answered the question, but that's the main point, that we, for example, the forest fires that we saw in Sweden in 2018, they are totally natural. What was unnatural was that the firefighters turned the fire off, so it burned only 23,000 hectares or something like that. I mean, it was a huge disaster. Or like the storm disaster Gudrun in 2005 or 6, I don't remember exactly, but 75 million cubic meters of timber was falling down. So basically the yearly cuttings of Sweden or Finland. And that was totally natural as well. A total disaster, but sort of it depends what do we want to mimic.
Thank you, Pasi. Thank you. I see a hand raised of Jürgen Bauhus. Please, you have the floor.
I would just like to add that it is often held belief that even-aged even-aged forestry based on large clearfields is mimicking natural disturbances. I think this is cutting it a bit too short. Natural disturbances create very complex patterns with a lot of legacies, dead standing trees, deadwood on the ground, seedlings that survive, some trees that survive. So I think if we embrace this more of this complexity that is generated also by natural disturbances, yes, I think then we can also expand this concept of closer to nature forest management to develop systems that work with larger even age stands that include some of these legacies, etc., yeah, to make them more natural. But there's a huge difference between a stand or a condition that has been created by natural disturbances and one that has been created by clear felling and removing all biomass. I think that must be clear.
Thank you, Jürgen. The next question from the panel, from the audience, is addressed to Tiago from Tamas Sedlak from the, we had this already, sorry. It's addressed to Tudor from Martin Jensen, a Swedish consultant on close to nature. Could undisturbed natural processes allow the forest to adapt to future climate? And should managers rely on natural processes and reduce their management action as far as possible, as the future climate is unknown?
Yeah, well, we as managers are predicting what will be. We don't know what will be. And that's true, but that is the biggest challenge of forest management. We are dealing with very long living ecosystems. So yes, but then we are basing our measures, hopefully, based on all the knowledge we have gathered so far. And I think we do have a good amount of knowledge already. Now, what will happen in the future? It's hard to tell. And I think is not necessarily a huge difference between doing management and leaving forests as they are, as long as we are doing something close to nature. So we are mimicking the natural disturbances. And who says that the forest itself wants to be prepared for what will be in 100 years or so? It will be disturbed if something bad happens, and then it will regenerate in a different way, in a different composition. So the patterns of change are clearly, we don't know them, and I believe the forest doesn't know them now, the patterns of change which will be in 100 years or so. So I don't think we should be that afraid of doing management. And actually, that's not an option. We cannot, I don't believe that just sitting and doing nothing will fulfill our needs for clean air, clean water, biodiversity, and climate mitigation. I don't think that's truly an option. We cannot afford it. Actually, we want even more resources nowadays. But that is not only that we cannot afford that, I don't believe that the forest, if we leave it as is, will never be disturbed in the future by whatever the climate will do. I think it will be. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Tudor. Thanks very much. The next question from the audience is addressed to Jürgen Bauhus from Soltan Kuhn from Wild Europe. And he's asking, how did the possible leakage take into account the idea of trying to decrease our consumption patterns? What about the demand side mitigation options? You're muted, Jürgen. Sorry.
Thanks. First of all, I would recommend looking at that study. And yes, it did consider that. As I said, it's in the scenarios or the model, they arrived at a 73% replacement replacement of the timber that was less produced in Europe through imports. So the remaining 27% were actually the result of reduced consumption, for whatever reason. That could be a deliberate reduction in use, or one that's driven by increases in prices for timber. So they certainly considered that in their model studies. But certainly, yes, there is potential also to use the timber that we harvest more efficiently, through a more staggered cascade. Currently, the much mentioned cascade use looks at the first product stage, which may be in some form of solid wood product, and then things get typically burned. Yeah? So that's not a real cascade, it's more like a waterfall. What we really need is also a design of wood products for multiple staggered uses, so that they remain longer in the system and the carbon is stored in wood products for a longer period than it is currently. And that may reduce then also the overall need.
Thank you, Jürgen, for explaining this. I now see, I thought it was, are there any hands raised from the room in Brussels? If not, I have a third question to Jürgen Bauhus from Adrian Tristan from the European Commission, DG Research and Innovation. And he wrote, Professor Bauhus mentioned that currently forest management in the EU goes in the direction of less forest plantation, more close to nature forest management, and more protected forest, which might have negative implications on the wood supply. Which of the trends do you believe should be reversed?
Well, I think it's the wrong question, to be honest. I think we should ask, how could we achieve that these things are developing congruently in the right direction? Let me give you an example, which I experienced myself when I was still working in Australia. The Australians at the end of the last century had a process which was called the ARC, the Comprehensive, Representative and Adequate Reserve System, so CAR reserve system, regional forest process. And as part of that, at the regional level, they reserved a certain percentage of forest ecosystems in their natural conditions, in their natural communities. But they also, and also old growth forests, so not dissimilar to what we're trying to do here in Europe. But at the same time, they also sat down and really calculated what is the consequence of this. For forest industry, for demand, etc. And they decided in many instances to compensate the transfer of multiple use forests into reserves with the establishment of plantations, to maintain industry and to maintain a desired supply. I don't see that happening here in Europe. It's sort of we pushing it aside, something that we solve, for example, through imports. And it's, in my view, a very inconsequential policy framework that that's operating there at the moment.
Thank you, Jürgen. So the next question from the audience is addressed to Professor Domingos from Kees Hendricks, WUR. And he said, nice to see your study on ecosystem services. Balancing ecosystem services also need balanced finance. As has been said, 90% of the income of private foresters is generated by timber production. Close to nature forestry also aims at delivering other forest ecosystem services. What can be done to stimulate the production of ecosystem services financially and socially?
Okay, so thank you very much for the question. So just the context here. So in this case, the main source of income, if you have cork oak montado, is the cork. So it's not timber, but it's a forestry product. And in the case of the holm oak, it's not even that. They just have the grazing animals. So the question is very pertinent. And in fact, it was the second half, which I didn't talk about, of our EcoPole project, where we did an economic valuation of some of these ecosystem services, just a restricted subset because the scientific literature didn't allow us to do more, and where we calculated an adequate payment for these ecosystem services. So my answer is unequivocal. The only way to have these ecosystem services sustainably provided by these landowners and farmers and forestry managers is by society paying them for the ecosystem services.
Thank you, Tiago. The next question is addressed to Tudor again from Benjamin Frank, advisor to MEP. You mentioned buffer zones when speaking about protection of old growth forests. How important are buffer zones in this regard, and what kind of management or level of protection would you see fit for buffer zones?
Well, actually, I said that nothing could prevent change, not even the buffer zones. So, and I don't think they will. Definitely not the natural change. And also many of the anthropogenic produced changes, again, like pollution or pollen or seeds or exotic species that are coming, or the climate change, if it's our fault. And I've heard this discussion about setting buffers, which would mean restricting management. I guess they're because people believe that if we set a buffer, that forest will never change and we'll always have in that place for, I don't know, millennia, an old growth forest, nice looking. I don't think that's the case. And honestly, if we think that the light, which might eventually reach the understory on the boundary, because we are doing management next to an old forest, will harm that old forest. But the light that is reaching the understory in many places inside because of natural disturbances is not harming. I think that's simplistic. I don't think that's true, actually. So we shouldn't be afraid of that change. We're not producing change by our management inside, but to really protect them from any change that has something to do with us, it is somehow against nature. Again, we are part of this nature. We are not robots coming from a different planet now and finding this old growth forest. We have been here for millennia as well. So we should do things to keep them and to learn from them. But one of the most important lessons that we learn from them is that they are changing in time. And yes, that the disturbances are also producing light that reaches the ground and the succession continues. So I don't think that buffering them and setting even more restrictions would help. Actually, I think this kind of management would make people move away from the idea of really embracing the protection of old growth forests. I hope this answers the question. Thank you,
Tudor. Next question is addressed to Andrei from Matthias Brummer, Xaxa per la Conservación de la Natura. Do current EU indicators allow to correctly monitor the conservation state and evolution of old growth forests or close to old growth forests?
Probably the question is about the pan-European indicators, because I'm not aware of the official EU indicators so far. And yes, to some extent, but the indicators they address several aspects of biodiversity, as I was trying to show this in my presentation. But on the other hand, there is a clear need to address additional aspects of biodiversity and forest protection and forest management in general, which have appeared only recently in the public discussion, because we must remember that the situation is not constant. We are experiencing changes in the paradigm of forest management, but we also experience changes in social attitudes and economic external factors the situation, and these indicators should also try to, they are needed to address better the questions the public is and decision makers are actually asking. So at the moment, I don't think the pan-European indicators they are sufficient to answer clearly and with certainty about the condition of biodiversity in forests, but they are very helpful and they are good starting point to develop indicators which would answer this question better.
Yes, I agree. Thank you, Andre. And the next question is addressed to Jürgen Bauhus. It's a combined question from Ivo von Trotha from AGDV in Germany and Soltan Kuhn from Wild Europe. How would you assess the impact of close to nature forestry on forest job opportunities compared to the current forestry practices? Could close to nature mean more or less jobs in the forestry sector? And how important is the motivation of forest owners and managers for closer to nature forestry?
Just as well, I typed in my answers to these questions already, so I had time to think about it. It's of course a difficult one. Let me say, first of all, that consequences of sort of a broad shift to more close to nature forest management should of course be analyzed now, so that we would see the consequences of shifts in policies and not do that later once these policies have already been implemented. And I think we're doing this kind of analysis way too little, not only in forestry. Secondly, it would have to be seen, whether jobs decline, if this leads to a reduction in harvesting levels, then this would very likely lead to a decline in direct forest-related jobs. Close to nature forest management enterprises have often actually worked very profitable, and largely because of the saving of costs. Say, for example, through using natural regeneration rather than planting. And of course, this also reduces jobs, but that would have to be analyzed. We have to consider, however, whether adopting a close to nature forest management approach may offer other opportunities for forest owners, also to generate an income that is not related to the harvesting of trees. I don't want to promise too much there, but there could be other opportunities that also create jobs. But I don't know a proper analysis that addresses this issue. Just a few points that I think that need to be considered in this discussion. And yes, motivation would be absolutely essential for implementing close to nature forest management. I don't think this is something that can be pushed by regulatory law. The people who own the forest, who manage the forest, they need to be convinced that they're doing the right thing there. And therefore, this needs a lot of education, training, technical support. And this is best done also through incentives rather than regulation.
Thank you, Jürgen, for these explanations. So there are a couple of questions now from the colleagues in Brussels, and I would like to give the floor to them directly now, please.
Okay. Ms. Stephanie, if you hear me, yes? I have one question. If the EU plans will implement the Tünen Institute calculated, the EU have to import more than 200 million cubic meters timber from Russia in the future. Is that realistic? It's a question to Professor Bauhaus, but also to all other experts in this floor. Thank you very much.
Maybe I can pick it up. As I said in my presentation, these estimations point to a problem, and they point to ethical and strategical questions that should be discussed. We are very good in Europe to pushing these problems aside until they hit us, like we see now, also with the war in the Ukraine. And I think, therefore, we need to be realistic and honest here. And I would certainly think that any strategy that makes us also dependent, very dependent on other countries. Today, we don't like to look at Belarus and Russia. In future, it may be other countries that we don't want to import our timber from. We make ourselves vulnerable, and we export some of the problems. And that's what I mean. We need a more honest forest policy that is trying to solve the problems as much as we can within Europe, rather than exporting them.
Thank you, Jürgen. Thank you. Does any of the panelists want to address this question as well? Then can we please continue with questions from Brussels directly? I see Roland Kautz. Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you, Mrs. Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, it's more or less a very simple question. I mean, assuming that substitution of fossil fuels by forest biomass or forest-based biomass will and has to take place, and that also the addressed need of decarbonization of the global economy has to happen, my very simple question to all speakers is, and this is based to all studies and the available scientific-based evidence, do you think that we will need more or less timber in the future to make the pending transformation to a bio-based economy successfully happen?
Who does want to answer to Robert Kautz's question? Roland Kautz, sorry. Tudor, please.
I'd like to give a short answer. I believe we will need. So it's not a matter of choice to find a coexistence with all the needs. Yeah, and it is a big challenge, and it will be a big challenge. Thanks.
And Pasi, please.
Thank you, Stephanie. Very, very important question and a huge question, but the short answer is that if we want to replace the concrete and steel in buildings, of course we need more timber. There is no other way.
Roland, I hope the answers were sufficient. And now, please, Mr. Neft, I think, also wanted to ask a question.
No, thank you. I asked the question. That was my question. Thank you very much.
Okay. Then there is another question from the audience to Tudor from Simon Poljansek. How do you define active measures for biodiversity?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, and it's complex somehow. And it depends on region, and it depends on the natural disturbances that happen there. But I think active management is management that mimics or emulates the natural disturbances. So I think it's quite wide in terms of chances or opportunities, as Professor Bauhus has underlined in his presentation. I do see nowadays anyway, a little bit of reluctance, yes, in terms of clear cutting, for example. I do think that they have their place in this equation, not everywhere, not in any kind of conditions, and not in any amount or sizes. But active conservation means if we know what the species need, we will provide those conditions. So yes, sometimes that would mean maybe even, I don't know, controlled fire, controlled burning, or a larger gap, or even a small clear cut, which means a larger gap. Or in other cases would mean something closer to single tree selection. But there is no one type of measure that would be the only one for biodiversity. And we shouldn't move to extremes. That's why I believe we should keep our options on the table, because if we really want to please all the species, then we really need to look at their needs, not at what we perceive bad looking. Okay, we're not, I don't think we will ever go into produce huge fires like the one in Australia. I hope we won't, and I don't think we should. But definitely closing the option of stand replacing disturbances would not be the option, a good option. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Tudor. And Tiago, please.
Okay, sorry, it's just because in two previous questions, there was just a rejoinder I wanted to make. One of them is associated to the geopolitical and environmental consequences of outsourcing our problems. And I'd just like to emphasize my support for the position that for both reasons, for environmental and geopolitical reasons, we do have to be very careful about when we apparently solve problems here in Europe, but essentially are become dependent on having things done elsewhere. So my full support on that. On the question about more or less timber, I would just like introduce a tone of gray here, because I think the opinions coming out were too black and white, too much of a black and white answer to that. These issues are complex and are uncertain, and we don't know how exactly technology will evolve in the future. So I certainly think that we should plan for the possibility that we need more timber, and we need to have adaptive management capacities on that, and well, plan and research and develop policies, thinking that that might be the case, but that might also not be the case. The future is open in terms of how technology develops, and so I wouldn't subscribe to a clear-cut comment as was given that for certain we need to replace steel and concrete with timber. Maybe yes, maybe not, because just as we're thinking of ways of solving the problems with timber, people working on steel and concrete are also themselves working on they're fully aware of the needs to decarbonize their production. So it's gray, it's not black and white, that it's for certain that timber and concrete will have to be overwhelmingly replaced by timber.
Okay, thank you very much, Tiago, for these explanations. And thank you very much for the lively and very interesting discussion we had so far. The time is flying, and we are coming now towards the end of this webinar. And I now invite Professor Bauhus and all panelists to kindly give us a short take-home message. Professor Bauhus, please.
Well, I think that close to nature forest management can be part of the solution, yeah? But it's only one element of it. We also need other systems in the wider landscape. But to be part of the solution, we need to develop a kind of closer to nature forest management that is rather open, yeah, and requires local adaptation. What we don't need is a very strict formulation of close to nature forest management. There are many different ways of integrating different forest management objectives within forest enterprises, and we need flexibility to these ways. There are many opportunities we can learn from fantastic examples in Europe how that can be done. Therefore, close to nature forest management is something that should develop also bottom up and not just by regulatory law from Brussels.
Thank you, Jürgen. Andrei Talacic, please, your take-home message.
Okay. We know that for historical reasons, forests in Europe have been influenced by humans to a large extent. Now the paradigm of forest management has changed to focus on sustainability, and the negative trends from the past have mostly been halted, and their effects are being reverted in many regions of Europe. But we must remember that forest significance in biodiversity varies, and in general, tropical and subtropical forests tend to support more species, and damage to them has bigger influence on the global biodiversity. So we must be very careful so that our European policies don't influence negatively other regions by this leakage effects and that we have been discussing it. And another message I want to leave us with is that the ways we collect information on forests must be aligned to the current situation, changing conditions, social attitudes, and political priorities. So we need high quality data for proper evidence-based decisions. And we also must take advantage of current technological advances and work to fully utilize and harmonize all kinds of data we have. Thank you.
Thank you, Andre. Professor Tudor Stansioi, please, your take-home message. You're still muted.
Okay, sorry. So coming back to my presentation, and not only, I think large scale is the only solution, and therefore active conservation is definitely the only way. Not the only one in a sense that strict protection has no reason at all, but then increasing the strict protection should be based on something that really brings into the equation. And we should look also at the disadvantages that it may bring in the equation. If it is about learning from nature without us, okay, but we might be able to learn from what we have. I don't know if we need more to learn more. And the second is being a meeting on close to nature, mostly. I also like to underline that we should really carefully choose what is close to nature, not only in a changing climate, which makes things much more complicated for us, but in general. And definitely not to go to an extreme to impose a one-type-fits-all solution, but keep our options open in a sense that we should look for those that are really close to what nature does, not to what we believe looks nice. Thanks.
Thank you, Tudor. Professor Dorota Dobrowolska, please, your take-home message.
My message is very short. I think looking from my presentation, also one question which I couldn't answer yet about hiding the forest management. I think that maybe I will tell that working together for the coherent management of our forests and better understanding of them. And this is my message, which we should take home.
Thank you, Dorota. Thank you. And now, please, Professor Tiago Domingos.
Okay, so I would emphasize two messages that previous panelists have emphasized themselves, but I would this issue that we need to manage what we do in Europe, avoiding detrimental side effects outside Europe, especially in situations like has just been mentioned, where forests outside Europe are more valuable for biodiversity than in Europe. So this certainly needs to be taken into account. Also, this issue of being adaptive and having a portfolio of solutions and developing it bottom up in terms of what's adequate for each region and each place. Even if I just think about Portugal, which is a small country, we already have enough diversity that one size fits all wouldn't work. And that's even more true for the whole of the European Union, certainly. But obviously, we also need some high-level strategic aims that have to be top-down. So we do need to reconcile the two approaches. A lot of this means that we need policy tools that allow flexibility for the forest managers to act. And among others, payments for ecosystem services are certainly one of them. You pay for the service, and then each forest manager makes his or her own choices about how to manage. And finally, and very much in this spirit of the portfolio of solutions, but also spatialize the idea of the portfolio solutions, we certainly need to work with mosaics and with diversity at the landscape level. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Tiago. And finally, also Professor Pasi Rautio, your take-home messages, please.
Thanks, Stephanie. There are already quite many take-home messages, so I don't know if if we can remember all of them, but I would just want to highlight the role of research in this issue. Quite many of the methods that have been presented in this under the label of nature-based or close to nature forest management are based on high hopes. So we already know that not all of the methods work everywhere. So we need to make sure that what we are doing, and we need to make sure that we are using the research as a basis of these decisions. Thank you.
Thank you, Pasi. What a treasure trove of valuable information. And I thank you so much for all your contributions and for the lively discussion and exchange with the audience, which raised super interesting questions. And I think we are all now well prepared with facts and research findings in relation to closer and closer to nature forest management to contribute this also in the various fora or working groups related to the ongoing EU biodiversity and forest policy debates. And finally, I will now hand over the microphone to the CEPF president, Mr. Sven-Erik Hammer, for some closing words. Mr. Hammer, please, the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Stephanie. So my name is Sven-Erik Hammer. I'm a forest owner from Sweden, and I am the president of CEPF. And CEPF is the voice of the European family forestry owners. And first, I would like to give a warm thanks to our moderator and our panelists for excellent work. And I would also give a warm thanks to all of you who participated today. You all have made very valuable contributions to these important discussions. So on behalf of EUSTAFOR and CEPF, many thanks to all of you. We can conclude that there are many ways for European forestry to get closer to nature. All of these practices are among a gradient. It is never black or white situation. And I must say, making everything gray is not the way forward. Diversity in nature, diversity of nature in the EU means a big diversity of possible approaches for closer to nature forest management. And continuous cover forestry is not the only way to mimic nature in European forests. It is also important to listen to science. And we look forward regarding the full policy brief being prepared by EFI on this topic. We are all part of nature, Tudor stated. All forest owners and managers in Europe is representing a wide diversity of EU forests. And one important fact is that all these owners and managers want their forests to be in good shape. There aren't any forest owners or managers who don't want to take ecosystems in account when planning and implementing sustainable forest management. And we have got many good examples today and can conclude that sustainable management of European forests is a global example of success in a world where deforestation and forest degradation is not unusual. European forests provide a diverse range of forest ecosystem services, and many parameters relevant to biodiversity have improved. And this is the result of long-term sustainable forest management. The forest owners and managers achieve achievements in social, environmental, and economic terms must therefore be acknowledged. The forests and the forest owners are also an essential factor for the future bio-based economy as a key element in mitigating climate change. But the forest owner now sees serious problems in the various initiatives from the Commission related to forest land and forestry. They are highly concerned about the consequences that these could have on their forests' long-term resilience, their motivation to manage, and their ownership rights. As we have seen today, forests in European Union are as diverse as their regions and locations. The forest owners and managers and the forest-rich member countries do not agree on the current policy development of the Commission's claimed EU competence in the field of forest management. Forest owners are very well aware of the biodiversity challenges worldwide, including in Europe. However, even the latest state of EU nature report showed that forest ecosystems in Europe had the most positive trends compared to other ecosystems in Europe. So the alarming statements of biodiversity crisis in Europe must therefore be put in perspective, taking in account overshadowed positive results. Because we all need a development that is better for the forest, better for the environment, and better for the member states and the Union. And today we see an environmental policy that drives Europe in a direction that in reality does not benefit the long-term development of society in general. The European Commission has so far underestimated the importance of products and energy from renewable forest raw material, being able to replace fossil materials and energy. And in the light of the devastating war in Ukraine, this attitude needs to be reconsidered. As more and more countries now realize that they need to quickly get out of their dependence on oil and gas from Russia and replace it with renewable raw materials and energy, where forests can contribute to a significant part. But this rebalancing of the EU policies is urgent. 2021 was the year of many proposals from the European Commission. 2022 is the year of negotiations and discussions. It is therefore important that the new geopolitical situation is taken into account before taking these decisions. So with this concluding remark, I again very much would like to thank all of you who participated today. So thank you and goodbye.
Thank you, Mr. Hammer, for the final statement and your concluding remarks. And with this, I'm going now to close this webinar. I hope the event lived up to your expectations, and I thank all participants and panelists for their contributions, and also the colleagues from EUSTAFOR and CEPF for preparing and organizing this webinar. Have a nice afternoon and goodbye.